Welcome back to On Listening. This is your host, Daniel Rosen. My next guest is the amazing Scott Miller, who I'm so honored to interview. Scott Miller, PhD, who is, I remember from the old days, one of the founding members of solution-oriented psychotherapy, and he now runs the founded the International Center for Clinical Excellence, is involved in feedback-informed treatment, using research methods to increase productivity among psychotherapists, and is an advocate of deliberate practice, and he has a book out that's on deliberate practice. Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Dan. I'm glad to be with you.
I am glad to have you. We were, in our little pre-talk, we did acknowledge that this is a second attempt at recording. I shouldn't say attempt. This is the second recording because we had a technical problem. So we're doing this again, and both of us are remarking at how in the past 2 or 3 weeks the world is a different place. Right now it is April 20th or 21st. You see, I don't even know the date. April 20th, 2020, the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and things are different, right, Scott?
You know, when your mortality is at risk, it really brings things into sharp focus. And it's a very different world than when we spoke 2 weeks ago. And I will say that we covered all of the secrets the last time, and I hope we can remember what they were.
Not secrets to resolving the pandemic, but secrets to listening.
That's right.
Well, it is true. I do want to get to some of that, but I think each of us is itching to talk about what's happening today, and it makes me think about when I'm going to release this episode in season 1. So, but I know that one of the things I walked away from, so I guess I could kind of distill it, is the difference when we're listening. Some of my other guests have talked about listening for affect, listening for emotion, and you describe the difference between implicit and explicit emotions. And I'm wondering if you can recap that, speaking both to therapists and then sort of anybody else who'd be listening to the show.
Well, we were talking about a study that my colleague, Daryl Chow, and I and some others have done called the Difficult Conversations in Therapy Project. And the reason for this project was that therapist outcomes do not improve over time and with experience.
Outcomes meaning their clients don't, on average, have a higher percentage of getting better or feeling better because of treatment as therapists age.
Yes, over time. And in fact, you know, we in our review of the research literature can't find much evidence that therapist outcomes improve after 50 hours of direct service. And in fact, there's some evidence. Did a study with a colleague, Simon Goldberg. All of these studies you can find on my personal website at scottdmiller.com. And this was a study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, so it's scholarly and well done, that therapist outcomes actually decline slowly over time. And the promise in my field, like in many fields, has been is that science would help us identify a protocol that if therapists followed it and applied it to the right kind of clients, and in that you can read the particular diagnosis or present a complaint somebody might have, then their outcomes would be better. And that's been the idea that's captured our entire field now for the last, really 30 years, since the 90s. And it hasn't panned out. So the field's overall outcomes are flat, actually since about 1976, when the first meta-analytic research was done, all the way forward to the present. We've gotten more granular and we're looking at individual therapist outcomes, and on average, they don't improve either. So our attempt has been to figure out how can we actually get better? And let me just back up and say, it's really critical to point out that I am not saying going to see a therapist doesn't help. There's overwhelming evidence that going to see a therapist actually helps. The question is, are we getting better at our work the more time and experience we have? And the answer to that is no. And this is a mystery that we've been working to unfold, not just our group, but many groups, and figure out what would it take. So can
I just elaborate a teeny bit?
Yeah, sure.
So I think one of the things you're talking about is the field as a whole, where we've evolved to allegedly be talking about more of the right things to talk about, as opposed to for example, a hyper focus on what happened between someone's, in a particular kind of family environment from age 0 to 3, for example. We've expanded the purview of what we look at in people's lives, but then any one individual therapist, despite ongoing training, no matter how many seminars and even hours of supervision, that particular therapist doesn't get better. So it's a dual failure to improve.
It is. It is a dual failure. And in fact, what's kind of curious and intriguing and comes right back full circle to the DCT study is that continuing education in the way that we currently do it, where you go sit in a workshop and you listen to somebody lecture and then you supposedly go home and apply those skills, doesn't really have any evidence behind it. There's no evidence that it works, and there's some evidence that it plays to our vanities. It makes us feel more confident than we actually should be. And the result is that our outcomes deteriorate slowly over time.
Oof. Now, to try to save the profession, because you did say we are effective, it's about, you're going to use something other than percentages probably, but approximately 70 to 80% of people who come to the average therapist, and the majority of therapists are average, about 70 to 80% of the time, that therapy is going to be effective for that client. Do I have the numbers approximately right there?
Not exactly right. So there's a couple of ways of talking about effectiveness. And the first one is to say, how effective is it relative to getting no help at all? This is the way we test psychotropic drugs. And so that research shows that the average treated person is better off than 80% of the people who get no help at all. But that's not the same as saying an individual has a 70 to 80% chance of succeeding once they're hooked up with a therapist.
Yes, I did want to get the 80% out there, that mostly it works.
Mostly it works. And if you're looking for when you hook up with a therapist for the very first time and the probability that that therapeutic encounter will result in a reliable change, that means greater than what would have happened by chance, greater than the passage of time, is probably somewhere around 60 to 70%. So the probability is quite good if you go that you will get some help, but there's also a significant chance that going won't help you. And in that particular case, you have to hope that both you and the therapist can talk about this openly so that A, the therapist can try to adjust what they do. B, they can add services, meaning maybe you need a group in addition to individual, or perhaps a drug might help you rather than just straight talk, or vice versa. And C, sometimes relationships just don't work out. That's what really psychotherapy is. It's a special relationship where you can go and talk to this individual, hopefully openly about your concerns. But as I say, you can't marry everyone you date. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. In that particular case, your therapist would have to be willing to entertain the idea that maybe someone else could be more helpful.
Got it. Okay, so I think this was a mild or your prelude to implicit and explicit emotions.
It is. And let's go back to the DCT, because everybody's trying to figure out how to make this more effective. And what that means is therapists need to monitor and measure their outcomes. They need to measure how well connected they are with their client, and secondly, how much that connection helps the client make a change in their life. Once they know their baseline performance, then we begin to parse that data and look for shortcomings or weaknesses. That's how you improve. You find the muscle set that is weakest and you work that particular muscle. And one of the muscles that is weak on occasion with some therapists is their ability to connect empathically. Most therapists get some empathy training in the very early stages of their school, and maybe a little bit at workshops, but the vast majority are not well trained in empathy. And that's very strange, because the effect size of empathy is about 0.5 or 0.6. Let me give you something to compare that to. The effect size for psychotherapy in general is about 0.8. So you can see what a huge part feeling understood is in terms of getting the help that you actually need. And So we measure the therapist empathy levels, and then we have helped develop a training course that we teach them in the DCT, the Difficult Conversations in Therapy Project. And there we've adopted a principle-based approach to helping them learn how to respond more empathically. If you've seen any show on television about therapists, it's almost a joke when the therapist says things like, "What I hear you saying is," or "so you're telling me that." These are very generic kinds of statements. They're not tied to the individual who's delivering them or the person that is being listened to. And yet, at the same time, we need to be able to provide listening that both people can relate to. So one of the
What do you mean both
principles,
people? Wait, what do you mean both people?
both the therapist and the client in the room. If I teach you stock phrases, what I hear you saying is, they have a certain kind of stockiness to them. They don't sound personalized. A computer could do that, really, or I could simply write it on a piece of paper and mail it to people. So I have to be able to deliver a response that the client feels is specific to them. And in order to have that, the therapist has to deliver that empathic response in a way that is congruent with who they are as a person. We have to get away from those stock phrases. And to do that, what we've been doing is teaching therapists principle-based approaches to empathic listening. And one of those principles is helping them separate out the explicit identification of an emotion and the implicit identification of an emotion. So client comes in and says,
sorry,
I've been feeling.
Hold on. I just gonna just so what you talked about the effect size. So basically, of the benefit from therapy, a huge chunk of that comes from the empathic alliance right there.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
And it should be even more amazing given that if you look, just open a catalog, go online, even if you're not a therapist, and type continuing education for therapists, and you are not going to find a workshop on empathy.
No, you are not. And then, and then empathy happens. You're going to make my day here. There's something about listening that has to be done effectively, or we have to listen in certain ways that are going to increase our empathy and then being able to convey that back to the client. I think that was part of what.
Yeah. So I think this is complicated because empathy, if a therapist is empathic and no client is around in the woods to hear it, well, it didn't happen. So empathy is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
And that's part of the reason why you want to teach therapists principle-based responses rather than stock phrases.
You have to give an example of that. I don't even know what you mean by that.
Yeah, and let me give you an example. When a client comes in and says, "I'm depressed," it doesn't take a rocket scientist to simply reflect that feeling. So you're feeling very depressed. That's the explicit emotion. And in fact, lots of people can do that relatively easy. What's much more challenging is to identify the implicit emotion. You're feeling very depressed and stifled in your efforts to connect with your loved ones. So there are two levels to this. One is what's obvious, and the second one is what's implied. And when therapists do both, the clients tend to experience a deeper sense of empathic resonance with the helper. And by the way, this is something that, this doesn't have to do with just therapy. You could do this if you're listening to your partner or your child. The child comes home and is mad about the teacher having done something. Well, I guess they're not coming home right now, but maybe online. Mad or upset about doing something. And you can reflect, you're feeling very angry, but you're also disappointed that the teacher didn't somehow see your unique skill set. So we're highlighting both, and when you feel listened to in that way, it stops you in your tracks. It happens so rarely, and so we've been helping therapists with a series of similar kinds of principles, but the explicit implicit one is one of the big ones.
So a take home for people who are working on being more empathic and listening to their partners would be to notice the explicit emotion, a person looks angry or sad or afraid, and then take a stab at the implicit emotion.
Yeah, take a stab at it. And you're going to have to say that based on who you are, or in a way that's congruent with who you are, as opposed to saying it in a stock phrase. I hear you saying you are depressed. It doesn't have any, what's missing from that. Just virtually everything is missing from that. And
Yeah.
then listen for that implicit emotion. This is sort of like, and what more are you saying to me that is not being said explicitly? Tapping that and being able to feed that back is an amazing skill to have. And as I say, it often stops people dead in their tracks. And then you can take on a different part of the conversation, because now the person feels like you get me.
Got it. So I did, while I'm definitely not trying to run a tutorial podcast on how to listen, but mostly experiences. But I like this because it's small, right? It's like a perfect kind of deliberate practice option here. It's small, it's simple, and you can repeat it endlessly and make small gains. So when you say a skill, I don't want the audience to hear that they do or don't have this skill, right? That's the whole key with deliberate practice.
Yeah.
Every skill is increasable.
Yeah. And it's increasable. And what's critical is finding out where you're at. So if this idea of the implicit emotion is novel to whoever might be listening, you would be in an observer mode for a while and just notice as people express things to you and you're trying to listen at both of these levels, the explicit and the implicit level. Maybe you take time to think after the conversation, because it's not going to be right at your tip of your tongue when you first start doing this. So after the conversation, sit down, try to write out what exactly more was being said here that wasn't stated explicitly. And then you can test it out later on. And by doing this repeatedly, you increase your capacity to communicate empathy to people.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. So we hit implicit and explicit emotions from the past. So I jotted a note because I've been following your Facebook a little bit, and there's this pandemic happening. I'm wondering if one of the avenues that might be of interest to you, and you just tell me if it's less so, is this idea of listening to data. Because I think that a lot of your efficacy studies on psychotherapy are about listening to data, not to the words of the therapist. So is that I'm pretty sure it's important, or I imagine it's important now as we think about how to be healthy as a country with a pandemic, but also in terms of improving our listening ability. How much tell us a little bit about listening to data, or if that phrase works for you.
I think it works, but I would say that the real challenge for me is that the sort of popular phrase right now is, well, the science says. Well, I don't know if you notice this, but there is no the science out there. What you have are people who interpret the science. Those people are called scientists. And there is no data that we can say this answers all of the questions. And you can see the example of that in how this whole pandemic has unfolded and our response to it. The information is growing every day, and you need somebody who can say this is what it means. And when we're
those
trying
are
to
data whisperers.
Yeah, I mean, I get that.
You don't like it. You don't like it. That's fine.
but not really, because I think it means that there are facts that don't need interpretation. And science really is about interpretation and looking at the same set of facts and seeing something potentially different in those facts.
Okay.
And for me, as a person who is a practitioner of the scientific method, I value in that two things. The first is peer review. I need somebody else looking, because I can fool myself so completely. The second thing I like to do is imagine the counterfactual. I like to think about what's the opposite of this. So right now we've adopted a particular strategy in dealing with the pandemic. And throughout this process, I've been thinking, what's the counterfactual? What are we missing here? What are we not looking at? What is the untold story here? That doesn't add a lot of that makes people feel upset, because of course what we like is as a species is clarity. Just tell me to stay home and stay home forever, and okay, I guess I'll do that begrudgingly, but I'll do it. And I've, in my posts on Facebook and in dealing with the pandemic, I've really been wondering, are there alternate ways? Can we interpret these set of data differently?
Okay. Yes, so do you want to talk more about that and what's relevant and for today?
About the response to the pandemic?
Yeah.
I think that it seems very clear we've been, as we started off the podcast, confronted with our mortality. And I've been impressed, despite the occasional coverage of people protesting, at the level of compliance. It's amazing, and it's inspiring at some level. At the same time, from the outset, I've been talking about the need for a medium and long-term plan that encompasses both the health and other consequences of how we're dealing with the pandemic. Currently, the public health establishment and epidemiologists are guiding the entire process. But as time goes on, there are going to be other consequences. We're seeing them already. Women's shelters are filled to the brim. Students in Chicago can't log on to the system because they have no computers at home. Reports of child abuse have dropped here 50%. And that's not because children aren't being abused. It's because they're not in the eye shot of people who've noticed that they're abused, who've seen it. And economically, we have 24 million people unemployed right now. Now, this isn't, as I think polemicists tried, this isn't a battle between turning on the light switch and keeping it turned off. This is about plowing some middle way, and that means confronting our fear. Do I sound like a psychologist here or not? Directly. That, in fact, addressing the real likelihood that a given individual is likely to get and then succumb from this disease, and then plotting some middle way that embraces that reality.
So you're thinking sort of a long game, not like when do we open the country or...
I'm thinking that the current strategy is, well, I don't even call it a strategy. Shutting everybody in their homes is a response. It's not a strategy. A strategy is, how do we emerge from that in the medium and long term? And right now, emphasis, and it's perfectly understandable, is been placed entirely on health consequences. The number who are dying, and the media has fanned those particular flames by reporting to the public statistics that are absolutely meaningless. So, for example, the number of deaths per day is absolutely meaningless. It also flattens out the experience of COVID-19. So just before we began to speak, I got an announcement that a child had died from COVID-19. Now, when you hear that without context, as somebody who looks at data constantly, it creates a false impression. And the false impression is, oh my God, everybody is likely to die from this disease. But no context is provided. Instead, the headline is attention grabbing. 8-year-old dies from COVID-19. Is that a tragedy? Absolutely. Is it likely? Absolutely not. It's not likely. That's what all the data is showing. that doesn't mean we're not going to have to make difficult choices. We will have to make difficult choices because we're balancing two competing needs: the need for remaining alive and the need for having an economy that functions, and our psychological well-being. And the items that I talked about just a moment ago: child abuse, women's shelters, food lines with miles of cars waiting to pull up so that they can be fed. These are very frightening realities.
Yes. I so you're helping me refine my question about what I mean when I think about listening to data is I don't have the research methods training to um, to see if a research article truly proving that an outcome, if there's if there's a case to be made that's not actually proved by the data. And when you talk about a news article of an 8-year-old died of COVID, how a listener, how does a listener sort of know, or is there a way for people to listen to that without being swayed in an alarmist way? We know that very few children are going to die from COVID, and it's a tragedy that one did. But we're much more worried about the elderly. How do we? Is there a way to be more tuned into what's relevant and less tuned into what's not relevant?
I think people really do try to do that. I think most of us try to do that. We try to take the data with a grain of salt. But let me give you a couple of hints, and I've mentioned one already, and that is the counterfactual, which is: do you know any child that's died in your neighborhood? How about your town? How about your state? Could you find that out? That is, with the access to the web, you can generally begin to get a sense of the representativeness of the particular statistic that is cited. The second strategy is to crowdsource. The worst kind of science is the one everyone agrees on. The best kind of science is when there is strong peer review. And while that process isn't perfect, it is so much better than one person with an opinion, because we know expert opinion, so-called expert opinion, can be really off and distorted by their prejudices, biases, and agenda. So crowdsource. And while it's not perfect, put the study on Facebook and ask for commentary. Read the commentary about a particular study by people on Facebook to see if you can get a sense of a broader view and critique of any particular study. But I, like you, find the process overwhelming, and I've spent the last month really trying to learn this lingo that's being used to describe the current COVID-19 outbreak so that I'd be able to make better assessments of the research. And I think there is some consensus about how to deal with this. What we still lack, as I say, is much of a medium or long-term plan that takes into account all of the consequences and helps us embrace what are going to be losses no matter which direction we go.
Mm-hmm.
There are also some psychological principles. So let me give you one of them. Loss aversion. We are loss adverse, meaning that if given a choice between a sure thing and a bet that actually might help us earn more money, we take the sure thing because we don't want to lose. And the current framing of the epidemic, I think, plays to our loss aversion. I can stay home for a couple of weeks, and that will help me avoid dying from this disease. It's a small loss weighed against what appears to be a gigantic loss, until you look at the likelihood, especially if you are young, with no comorbid conditions, of actually dying from this disease. Then, in fact, that loss is insignificant compared to the loss of income for 2 weeks, a month, or 2 months, or some people talking about 6 months to a year. So loss aversion is something that we can pay attention to. How is my choice being skewed by trying to protect myself from a perceived big loss at the end. And how likely is it that that's going to happen?
So those are little tricks to listen in a way where you're less likely to be biased by an intentional effort by a writer or a listener to push you in a particular direction,
or just their particular bias.
Yeah,
may not
right.
even be motivated, but all of us have a slant, and I have a slant as well on the data. And what I have really valued from is to put my opinion out there and then have people say, well, what about this? And it's shaped my view. It's something that I, as a science writer, value when I am turning in a manuscript, that I have other people who are largely dispassionate about me. They don't even know who I am when I submit the article to a journal, and they're finding things, different ways of viewing the data, problems in how I've conceptualized my interpretation of that data that didn't even occur to me. They help me fill in and see my blind spots.
Yes, there's a little the gap between you and them is helpful for people not wanting to heap on praise or be overly critical, that blinded to who you are a little bit.
Let me give you one more, and you may have noticed this, but it's beginning to wane a little bit. But it's very predictable behavior, and that is, at the start of this pandemic, there are all sorts of pieces of advice floating around about what you can do. So you gargle, and this will reduce it. You
Yeah.
take this particular drug, and that will help it. This is classic human behavior. In the midst of uncertainty, we look for any sign to hope for, when really probably what we need to do at the beginning is what we did: hunker down. When you have incoming fire in a firefight in the military, you hunker down, but you can't stay in that location, or the risk of dying there are greater. So we got to get out of the foxhole. We got to move forward at some point.
Mm-hmm. So to switch a little bit, tell me a little bit about listening as you think about it, kind of almost a free association. What do you like? Do you have any opinions about what good listening is, or experiences that you want to share with listening?
I think good listening, as somebody who's in a committed relationship and has been for 30 years, is when my partner says, "You understood me." And that works in a couple of ways. It means I have to be asking for feedback on an ongoing basis. I have to be observing whether or not whatever I say to them indicates, and however I act indicates, that I am paying attention. Anybody who's been in an argument with their partner has had the partner say, "You're not even listening to me."
Yeah.
And so I got to wonder, what is it about me that is not conveying what I'm hoping to convey, or you don't seem to understand what I'm saying. I've explained this to you before. All of these things are statements about and feedback to me. The hard part in those situations when we're upset with one another is not to become defensive, but instead, like the peer review we were talking about just moments ago with regard to COVID-19, taking that as feedback. What is it I can change? How is it that I can act differently here?
I like that you brought up that a person would have resistances or blocks to being able to hear something because they might be triggered in some way. So I've noticed as I'm hosting, I'm listening, but I'm also paying a lot of attention to the associations and feelings and thoughts that come up. And I feel like I'm rapidly toggling back and forth between what's coming up and arising in me and what I'm hearing the other person say. Do you have a similar experience, or could you say a little what it's like to be listening to somebody?
As somebody who's done that as a way of making his living for the last 30 years, I have all sorts of associations, and the challenge really is to contain those. unlike a podcast or an interview, where that kind of jazzing might be entertaining and interesting, and it is. In an intimate relationship, I think it can be a sure pathway to not having your partner feel heard and understood. So I'm trying to really zoom in, and I'm listening for the things we've mentioned before. I want to make sure that I've understood what's being explicitly said and the implied emotion under that. I want to work to repair the whenever there's a breach in that listening. When, in other words, when the person's telling me I am not, in fact, feeling heard by you. So I want to attend to that and try to repair that and reestablish the engagement. And in the meantime, I'm working to control my focus so that I stay on that person rather than whatever associations might come up during that time. Now, I don't know if this is true, but sometimes when we're in a disagreement with somebody, or argument with a partner or child, letting our minds run to other subjects can be an interesting way to diffuse the situation, because we temporarily take a detour into something else and discuss that. But I think the healing doesn't come from the distraction. I think the healing comes from reconnection with those others that we're estranged from, even if just for the moment.
I like you use the phrase "jazz it up," and there's sort of the context of when we're listening. That in an intimate relationship or maybe a therapeutic relationship, there's an intense focus on listening to what the other person's saying, or a podcast or some other social engagement. There might be the benefit of riffing off that, and well, that reminds me of this, and or this is what arises in me, and then sort of the listener-speaker role switches to one person talking about what was activated in them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if this is related, so help me here. I'm hoping this isn't me just jazzing off the point. Early on in my career, and it didn't all happen at once. You see as a clinician 20 to 30 people a week, and occasionally people would either send me a note, or they would say, "Are you upset?" And I would say, no. It was so incongruent with my internal state. And after several years in practice, and I'd heard this. Suddenly, it dawns on me, maybe there's some pattern here, because I'm having a number of people say this over time. And when I began to watch myself on video, I noticed that I had an expression on my face. It was sort of like the look you might get on your face if you were lifting a heavy weight. So you kind of, and when I was listening to somebody intensely, I had this look on my face that I noticed over and over again that looked like I was lifting a heavy weight, and I could see where some might interpret that as anger. Internally, I didn't feel anything of the sort. But that's not what really mattered. I couldn't say to the person, well, I don't feel that way at all, so get over it. I couldn't say that. They were having a reaction to me. So what I had to do was change my face. I had to work purposefully and mindfully to not have that look on my face, to have a face that people viewed as receptive, curious, and open, friendly even.
And that's only going to happen if you deliberately practice and study your responses to people.
And be willing to change your responses. So your physical demeanor may be incongruous with your internal state. But if you really want your partner to feel like you're heard, if you really want your client to feel like you're heard, then now is not the time to explain to them that's just the way you are. If you're really listening, and if you want them to feel understood by you, well, then why not push yourself to make that particular change?
I can think of all kinds of reasons, but yes, logically Logically, yes.
Yeah.
So tell us something, an experience you had where you felt particularly well listened to, or you could toot your own horn and talk about an example where you felt you were a particularly good listener.
So, not unlike a lot of therapists, I have several different times entered into therapy myself and at different stages in my life. And maybe I've done this 5 or 6 times. Uh, the last time I went to therapy wasn't actually too long ago. And the person I was working with was, I can't even put my finger on it, differently. He was different, and in a good way. I think I'd told the story that I told him eventually to many therapists and to family members uh, multiple times over the course of my life. But I can almost picture the moment when I was telling this story and he identified and fed back this implicit emotion, something that I wasn't even aware of at the time, that when he said it, it was such a profound experience, and it released the story. I didn't have to tell the story anymore to anybody after that. So that's the most current one where I just had this profound sense of finally, you get it. You get it. And in that, on his part, there was an acceptance of that emotion as well. An emotion that for me, I think at an implicit level was uncomfortable to have, that I didn't like having. And that yet when he acknowledged it, I felt that not only did he understand it, but it was an accepted part of me. I didn't have to wall it off, divide it off anymore. And it was really a very profound moment.
Those are lovely. That sounds, I don't know the story, but the idea that you were released from the burden of having to retell the story, the sort of met your own criteria for resolution.
And I think that, at least for me, many people had acknowledged that emotion, but it was almost like the acknowledgement of it, me telling it and the acknowledgement of it became reinforcing in and of itself. I would tell it over and over again and think, yeah, the fact that people either laugh or feel sad, that's the whole point of this story. But that wasn't the case when I told the story to this particular therapist. Then I was suddenly, this emotion was accepted and understood, and I could let it go. And the story that I was telling him I've never felt the need. I don't even think about the story anymore. Yeah. I've just moved on.
Well, I'm glad.
So I'm thinking of a occurrence right now that happened. This is, again, very, very simple. But I spend my life generally on planes, not lately, but I'm traveling always, every week, doing seminars and research. And as often happens, the plane I was to take was delayed due to weather. And there was an elderly couple sitting maybe 2 or 3 seats away, and the gentleman went up to the desk to talk to the person that works for the airlines and asked, "Do you know when our plane will be leaving?" Now, it was chaos at the desk and in this terminal because all the planes were delayed due to weather. Everybody was a little bit on edge. And the person at the desk said, "Sir, we don't control the weather. I'll let you know as soon as we know." And the man turned and walked away. And I thought, wow, how easy it would have been to actually listen to what he said. So it is frustrating. That's the explicit emotion.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you're worried about you and your wife being too tired or worn out or not having someplace comfortable to sit. the implicit state emotion, which is what I heard as soon as they walked up here, that they were concerned, given their age, about their lasting late into the night, etc. But none of that was heard or repeated back.
That is, I see that kind of thing, and when I'm super stressed, I've responded that way, and I've hated being on the receiving end of a comment like that.
And the whole purpose of the comment like that is shut up and sit down.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of that, not to bring things full circle. I hope this isn't too rambling for you or for the listeners. I see that happen a lot with this discussion around COVID. So if people express some frustration about social distancing, which is another term I can't stand, physical distancing is really what this is about. You know, if they express their frustration, what they often get is shamed for that.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, you're going to kill everybody, including my grandma? Well, wait a second. That wasn't the point now, was it? You're feeling super frustrated and you're worried how you're going to pay your bills. Explicit, implicit.
Isn't it funny how people listen differently? So, of course, we're doing physical distancing, and it was called social distancing. And I had this conversation with my spouse. When I heard the term social distancing, I knew that it was physical distancing. So in my head, I'm like, well, why would someone call it social distancing?
Yeah.
I thought, okay, what they're really trying to say is we're not building fortresses around ourselves. We're going to socially distance. 6 feet. 6 feet is a way to distance yourself, but still be social.
Well, that's interesting. You know, the term actually comes from epidemiology. And you can tell the epidemiologists and not psychologists have been in charge of the implementation of our current strategy, because I think that if you use words that mean something, then that kind of interpretation, the mental gymnastics you had to do to make it make sense to you, go directly to what people need to do. Stay away from people physically, but please don't socially distance.
Yes, that's what we want. Yes, yeah. And I put it all in. And it's true. I do this gymnastics. One of the guests I interviewed, that episode hasn't aired yet, or not as of April 20th, talks about telling, do we tell stories in our head when we're listening? And I think I was doing that. I was trying to come up with a story to justify what I heard rather than objectively hear, no, we're physically distancing, not socially.
Yeah. Well, and what that displays to me is an attempt. I think this is what we humans do. It's actually a kind of listening. You work to make it make sense. So listening in and of itself is an attempt to make it work between us. And we will often take what people mean and say, and we'll twist it to make sure we've understood it. And all our group has added is this feedback and principle-based component. Check in, make sure. So are you saying this? If you're having a disagreement, one of the first things you can do, and it is so hard precisely at the moment you need to do it. When you're pissed off, when you don't feel like listening is the moment you need to make sure that you restate what the other person is saying first. It's challenging, but with discipline, you can do it. Right. As opposed to doing the gymnastics in your head and coming up with a 50-50 probability that you'll be right.
That would be a helpful tip for me.
It's one that my partner is constantly telling me she wishes I would learn.
I'll take it out of the conditional. That is a helpful tip for me. I'm tempted to, you were talking about rambling. I appreciate you rambling, jazzing it up. This is a podcast. So I'm happy to have you wander around like that. And I'm going to tell you, I've been dying to ask this question of somebody. And so I think in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask it.
Okay.
Can we listen to, it's a philosophical question. Can we listen to something that's perfectly new? Because the brain has patterns, and we do tell stories. We know that words are metaphors. They mean something. And so can you convey a completely new thing to somebody, or are we only really just re-experiencing in different jumbled masses already known information when I listen to somebody? Did that make sense?
I think so. With simple commands, I think that is possible. Don't run in the street. if we step back from that, then it becomes much more difficult. If we ask a philosophical question, well, don't run in the street. Does that mean it's okay if I walk in front of the car? So I think that the key here is feedback and connection, as opposed to thinking that words convey exact meanings.
Right.
As somebody who writes a great deal, I know how difficult it is to communicate what I'm saying to others, let alone explain it to myself.
Oh, you know who's been
So,
I just have to say, who's been so helpful for me is talking to people who are on the autistic spectrum are so helpful in really understanding what words mean. There's so many baked in assumptions I have
yeah,
for neurotypicals that neuroatypicals are like, is that what you're talking about?
exactly. So there's all sorts of context and social rules that influence the meaning, and the way we've dealt with that as a group doing research about this is to develop a couple of very simple feedback tools that can be used. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But what we do know is that when therapists use these tools to solicit ongoing feedback about the work from their clients, that those clients are 2.5 times more likely to experience improvement than when the same therapists don't use the tools.
Yeah, it's an impressive number. That's an
So,
impressive number.
so for me, again, it is about this feedback process and constantly checking in and making sure that I'm understood. A lot of the battles in the people's lives that I work with as a therapist are about the misinterpretations that occur and the lack of a feedback loop that allows for those things to be corrected in time.
So in a very broad sense, listening requires, in order to effectively listen, we have to selectively choose information to send back to find out if we got it right or to tweak it and hear it again in a slightly different form.
Yes. And I think then, to bring this full circle to the conversation about deliberate practice, it's something that we need to practice.
Yes.
We need to notice when we're off, when what we've said hasn't conveyed the meaning we'd hoped for or had the impact that we hoped for, and then work purposefully to improve. And one of the guides to that is to look at some of these principles we've talked about in the time that we've had together that we could apply in our unique way.
I'm really glad the deliberate practice is becoming more talked about. You have a book coming out about it.
I do.
And full disclosure, it's not an endeavor I've begun. Well, I have you. But maybe for a deliberate practice around running a podcast would be for me to listen with someone who's had more experience as sort of an expert at recording shows, and listen with that person and then work on particulars of areas where the interview could have been stronger. That would be deliberate practice, right?
It would. And one way to start, if I'm given advice, is to look for which podcasts you do that generate the most listeners, the most likes, and then taking those apart and seeing what is it that made this one less interesting to people. And I think this is where producers are really essential, because we're not just listening in general, but you need somebody to help you tweak and make sure that you're getting the strongest part of your message over to people.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to do that too. Well, hopefully this hour will generate lots of likes and shares and reviews. And I loved the time. The second time around, different and just as good. In fact, I feel much better. I know I was very keyed up coming into this, and I feel much more relaxed and connected. So I can't thank you enough for that.
Well, I've enjoyed it as well. And if there were some recording out in space of what we did last time, I think that would show that it's been quite different. And for me, it's been off my usual script. You know, I have a very narrow area that I work in terms of research, and this is ranged far from that. And so I do hope that people provide feedback, say what they like and they don't like, because I know that I'm interested in that in order to improve.
You are quite interested in getting feedback about your work, right? And how you present too, yes? And how you...
Absolutely.
Good. All right. Thank you so much, Scott. And that concludes another episode of On Listening. Thank you so much for listening. You can email me, dan@onlistening.net. I'm interested in suggestions for guests for the show, comments, questions. I'm going to read everything that you write. Like and subscribe, share on my Facebook page, rate and review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thank you so much.